"You don't belong in first class. This ticket must be stolen or fake." The words sliced through the morning air of American Airlines Flight 1847 like a blade through silk. Carmen Rodriguez didn't whisper them. She didn't hesitate. She delivered them with the cold certainty of a judge reading a death sentence loud enough for every passenger in first class to hear. The man sitting in seat 3A looked up from his phone. His name was Jerome Washington, though Carmen would never bother to learn it. What she saw was a black man in a gray sweatshirt and worn jeans, someone who didn't fit her narrow definition of who belonged in the premium cabin. What she didn't see was the federal badge hidden in his wallet, the 6 months of undercover work he'd just completed, or the storm she was about to unleash on herself and American Airlines. Before we dive into this story that will leave you speechless, I need to know something. Where are you watching from right now? Drop your city in the comments below. And if you believe that respect should never depend on what someone looks like, hit that subscribe button and give this video a like. Because in exactly 8 minutes, this flight attendant's prejudice would cost her everything and cost the airline $1.2 million. Trust me, you won't believe how this ends. It was 9:15 a.m. on a Tuesday morning at Phoenix Sky Harbor International Airport. Terminal 4 buzzed with the usual chaos of business travelers and vacation goers, but Gate A7 felt different. There was tension in the air, thick as the Arizona heat outside. Flight 1847 to Miami was running on schedule, which in airline terms meant they were only 15 minutes behind. The Boeing 737 sat at the gate like a sleeping giant, its engines silent but ready. First class was filling up quickly. Seat 3A had been claimed by Jerome Washington, a man who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else on Earth. Jerome adjusted his carry-on bag in the overhead compartment, his movements deliberate and calm. He wore a gray UCLA sweatshirt that had seen better days, dark jeans with a small rip near the left knee, and white sneakers that were clean but clearly well worn. His beard was fuller than he usually kept it a necessity from his recent assignment. To most people, he looked like a regular guy heading home. To Carmen Rodriguez, he looked like trouble. Carmen had been working flights for 18 years. She prided herself on reading people, on knowing who belonged where. She had perfected the art of the customer service smile, the one that could welcome a VIP passenger or freeze out someone she deemed unworthy. At 42, she ran her first-class cabin like a fortress, and today she'd decided Jerome was trying to breach her walls. She watched him from the galley, her dark eyes narrowing as he settled into his seat. Everything about him offended her sense of order. The casual clothes, the relaxed posture, the way he seemed completely comfortable in a space she felt he had no right to occupy. She pulled out her phone and opened the crew communication app, her fingers flying across the screen. "Potential issue in 3A," she typed to the other flight attendants. "Keep eyes open." Jerome pulled out his noise-canceling headphones, a pair of expensive Bose that were one of his few personal luxuries. He'd learned long ago that flying was easier when you could tune out the world, especially when that world seemed determined to remind you that you didn't belong in it. He was tired. Bone-deep, soul-weary tired in a way that 6 months of living a lie could make a person. The undercover operation in Phoenix had been successful. A major drug trafficking ring had been dismantled, dozens of arrests made, millions of dollars in narcotics seized. But the cost had been high. 6 months of pretending to be someone else, of earning the trust of dangerous people, of living in cheap motels and eating gas station food. Jerome was ready to go home to his apartment in Miami, to his own bed, to food that didn't come wrapped in plastic. He'd used his own frequent flyer miles to upgrade to first class. After half a year of coach seats on commercial flights and cramped surveillance vans, he figured he'd earned a little comfort. The extra legroom, the better service, the quieter cabin. It felt like a small reward for a job well done. Carmen finished her pre-flight checks with mechanical precision. She straightened the magazines in the seat pockets, aligned the safety cards, and ensured every blanket was folded to airline standards. She was a perfectionist in a profession that demanded it, but her attention to detail often crossed the line into obsession, especially when it came to passengers who didn't meet her expectations. Other passengers continued boarding. Michael Torres, a Hispanic businessman in his mid-30s, took seat 3B, right next to Jerome. He offered a polite nod, which Jerome returned with a slight smile. Michael had been traveling for work for over a decade and had developed the traveler's skill of reading cabin dynamics. He could already sense tension, though he couldn't yet pinpoint its source. Elena Vasquez settled into seat 2A, a Latina teacher from Phoenix heading to Miami for a conference. At 45, she had raised 3 children and taught hundreds of students, developing an acute awareness of unfairness in all its forms. She arranged her papers and laptop bag, preparing for a productive flight. In row 4, Isabella Santos adjusted her phone to capture the perfect angle for her travel vlog. The 19-year-old college student had built a modest following on TikTok documenting her adventures, and she never missed an opportunity to create content. What she didn't know was that she was about to document something far more significant than a routine flight. Carmen emerged from the galley clipboard in hand, ready to begin the beverage service. She moved through the cabin with practiced efficiency, her smile bright and welcoming for most passengers. She stopped at row 1, offering champagne and orange juice to the elderly couple in first class. They chose champagne, and she poured with a flourish. Row 2 came next. Elena looked up from her papers. "Orange juice, please," she said warmly. Carmen's smile remained genuine as she filled a glass with fresh orange juice and placed it on Elena's tray table with a cocktail napkin. Row 3 was next. Michael Torres glanced up from his laptop. "Coffee, if you have it, otherwise water is fine," he said. Carmen nodded. "We have fresh coffee brewing. I'll bring that right over." She poured his water first, then continued to the next row without so much as glancing at Jerome. Jerome waited. He assumed she would circle back, that perhaps she was handling requests in a specific order. Flight attendants had their routines, and he wasn't in any hurry. He continued reading emails on his phone, catching up on messages from his FBI colleagues. Row 4 received service. Isabella looked up from her phone with bright eyes. "Could I get a ginger ale? Flying makes me a little queasy." Carmen's maternal instincts kicked in. "Of course, honey. And here's some crackers. They help settle your stomach." Isabella beamed her thanks. Carmen returned to the galley to prepare Michael's coffee. She took her time ensuring it was the perfect temperature, adding cream and sugar packets to a small tray. She delivered it with ceremony, as if serving a 5-star restaurant customer rather than airline coffee. Jerome waited. 10 minutes passed. Other passengers had received their drinks, some were already asking for refills, but his tray table remained empty. He pressed the call button above his seat. The familiar ding echoed through the cabin. Carmen's head snapped up from her paperwork. She saw the light above 3A and her jaw tightened. She took her time, walking over each step, deliberate and measured. Yes. The single word carried the weight of annoyance and barely concealed hostility. Jerome looked up, his expression calm and polite. "Excuse me, I didn't receive a beverage during the service. Could I get some water, please?" Carmen's eyes narrowed. She looked him up and down, taking in his casual attire, his relaxed posture, his very presence in her pristine first-class cabin. "Sir," she said, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness that barely masked the acid underneath. "Are you sure you're in the right cabin? Economy is toward the back of the aircraft." The question hung in the air like smoke from a fire everyone could smell, but no one wanted to acknowledge. Jerome felt the familiar tightness in his chest, the one that came with being questioned about his right to exist in certain spaces. But 18 years with the FBI had taught him patience, and 6 months undercover had reinforced the value of staying calm under pressure. "I'm in the right seat," Jerome replied evenly, pulling out his phone to show his boarding pass. 3A, first class. Carmen barely glanced at the screen. Her eyes remained fixed on Jerome's face, searching for signs of deception that existed only in her prejudiced mind. These boarding passes can be faked, you know. We see it all the time. Michael Torres looked up from his laptop, uncomfortable with the conversation happening inches away from him. He'd seen Jerome's boarding pass when they'd both accessed the overhead compartment, had watched him settle in with the practiced ease of someone familiar with first-class travel. There was nothing suspicious about the man beside him except the color of his skin. Elena Vasquez had stopped reading her papers. As an educator, she'd developed finely tuned radar for injustice, and every alarm was going off. She watched Carmen's body language, heard the subtext in her words, and felt her blood pressure rising. Ma'am Jerome said, his voice still controlled. "I can show you my confirmation email, my credit card, my ID. Whatever you need to verify that this is my seat." Carmen's lips pursed into a thin line. The reasonable response would be to apologize for the confusion and bring the man his water. But reason had abandoned Carmen the moment she decided Jerome didn't belong in her cabin. "I'll need to see multiple forms of identification," she announced. "And I'll need to verify your payment method." Isabella Santos looked up from her phone, drawn by the increasingly tense conversation. Her content creator instincts kicked in, and she discreetly angled her phone to capture what was happening. Something told her this was worth documenting. Jerome reached for his wallet, moving slowly and deliberately. He'd learned that quick movements could be misinterpreted, could escalate situations that were already on edge. He pulled out his driver's license and credit card, handing them to Carmen with steady hands. Carmen examined the documents with the intensity of a forensic expert, holding them up to the light, as if checking for watermarks. The name matched the boarding pass. The credit card was clearly legitimate, but she wasn't ready to concede defeat. "This could still be fraudulent," she muttered loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. "We're trained to spot fake IDs." Ma'am Jerome said, his voice dropping to a quieter tone. "I'm not trying to cause any trouble. I just want some water and to get to Miami. That's it." Carmen heard something in his voice that she chose to interpret as threat. "Are you raising your voice at me because I don't appreciate passengers using that tone?" Jerome hadn't raised his voice. If anything, he'd spoken more softly. But Carmen was building a narrative, constructing a case against him brick by brick. Michael Torres was now watching openly, no longer pretending to work on his laptop. Elena had put her papers aside entirely. In row 4, Isabella continued filming, though she tried to be discreet about it. "I'm not raising my voice," Jerome said. "I'm asking for water." Carmen finally handed back his identification, practically throwing the documents onto his tray table. "Fine. I'll get your water. But I need to check with the captain about your behavior." "My behavior?" Jerome's eyebrows rose slightly. "What behavior would that be?" "You've been aggressive since you boarded," Carmen declared, her voice rising. "Questioning my authority, making demands." The accusation was so absurd that Jerome almost smiled. Almost. But he recognized the trap being set. Any reaction could be twisted into evidence of the aggression she was claiming. So he did what his training had taught him. He remained calm. "I haven't been aggressive," he said simply. "I asked for water." Carmen stormed back to the galley, her heels clicking against the aircraft floor like gunshots. She began preparing drinks with violent efficiency, slamming bottles and glasses with unnecessary force. Other passengers exchanged worried glances. The elderly couple in row 1 whispered to each other in concerned tones. Jerome closed his eyes and took deep breaths. He'd been through worse than this, much worse. Drug dealers had pointed guns at him, cartel members had threatened his life, corrupt officials had tried to intimidate him. One prejudiced flight attendant shouldn't be able to rattle him. But there was something particularly insidious about this kind of racism, the way it tried to make you question your own worth, your right to occupy space in the world. His phone buzzed with a text message from his supervisor. Great work on the Phoenix operation. Enjoy your flight home." The irony wasn't lost on him. Carmen returned with a plastic cup of water, setting it down with enough force to splash some onto Jerome's tray table. There she said, "Your water." "Thank you," Jerome replied genuinely. He meant it. Despite everything, he was grateful for the small kindness, even if it came wrapped in hostility. But Carmen wasn't done. She'd tasted blood in the water and wanted more. "I need you to move your bag," she announced, pointing to Jerome's carry-on, which was properly stowed in the overhead compartment. Jerome looked up confused. "It's in the overhead bin. That's where it's supposed to be." "It's not properly stowed," Carmen insisted. "I can see it sticking out. It's a safety hazard." Michael Torres craned his neck to look at the overhead compartment. Jerome's bag was perfectly positioned, no different from any other carry-on in the bin. "It looks fine to me," he said quietly. Carmen whirled on Michael. "Sir, I'm the flight attendant here. I'm responsible for safety on this aircraft. I know what's properly stowed and what isn't." Jerome unbuckled his seatbelt and stood up, reaching for the overhead bin. "I'll adjust it," he said calmly. He pulled his bag out slightly, then pushed it back in, ensuring it was completely flush with the other luggage. "Is that better?" Carmen inspected his work like a drill sergeant examining a recruit's bunk. "It's still not right," she declared. "The handle needs to be facing the other direction." The request was petty and unnecessary. Bag handles could face any direction as long as the bag was secure. But Jerome complied, rotating his bag 180 degrees. "How's this?" Better Carmen said, grudgingly. "But I'm watching you. Any more disruptions and I'll have to take further action." Jerome sat back down, his calm facade beginning to crack. He was an FBI agent, a federal law enforcement officer who'd just completed a successful undercover operation. He'd earned his seat in this cabin, earned his right to basic human dignity. But here he was, being treated like a criminal for the crime of flying while black. Isabella's phone captured it all. The unnecessary bag inspection. Carmen's hostile tone, Jerome's patient compliance. She was building a comprehensive record of discrimination in real time, though she didn't yet realize how important this footage would become. Elena Vasquez had seen enough. As a teacher, she'd dealt with bullies before, and she recognized the pattern. Carmen was picking on Jerome because she saw him as vulnerable, different other. Elena made a decision that would later prove crucial. She began taking notes on her phone, documenting every interaction with timestamps. The boarding process continued around them, oblivious passengers settling in for what they assumed would be a routine flight. But the tension in first class was palpable, a storm system building strength before making landfall. Carmen retreated to the galley once more, but she wasn't done with Jerome. She was just getting started. The bag incident had been a test, a probe to see how he would react. His calm compliance hadn't satisfied her. It had emboldened her. She began planning her next move, unaware that every decision she made was driving her closer to the edge of a cliff. Jerome tried to return to his emails, but concentration was impossible. He could feel Carmen's eyes on him, could sense her hostility radiating from the galley like heat from a furnace. He'd dealt with racism before. As a black man in America, it was unfortunately inevitable. But rarely had it been this blatant, this public, this recorded. His phone buzzed again. Another message from a colleague, Safe Travel's brother. The word safe carried extra weight now. This flight was supposed to be his transition back to normal life, his reward for 6 months of dangerous work. Instead, it was turning into another kind of operation, another test of his ability to maintain composure under pressure. Michael Torres caught Jerome's eye and mouthed, "This is crazy." Jerome nodded, slightly grateful for the small gesture of solidarity. It reminded him that not everyone was against him, that some people could see the injustice unfolding before their eyes. The engines began to warm up, that low rumble that signaled departure was approaching. Usually, Jerome found the sound comforting, a promise of forward motion, of leaving problems behind. But today it felt ominous, like the growl of a predator preparing to strike. Carmen emerged from the galley with a clipboard ready to perform her safety demonstration, but her eyes kept drifting to Jerome planning her next move in what had become a very personal war. The safety demonstration began with mechanical precision. Carmen moved through the familiar routine of oxygen masks, seatbelts, and emergency exits, but her performance felt different today. There was an edge to her movements, a tension that other passengers began to notice. Every few seconds her eyes would dart to seat 3A, where Jerome sat quietly reading his phone. Isabella Santos continued filming, now fully aware that something significant was happening. Her TikTok followers were used to her travel content, but this was different. This felt important, like something that needed to be documented and shared. She adjusted her phone angle to capture both Carmen and Jerome, making sure the audio was clear. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're preparing for departure," came the captain's voice over the intercom. "Flight attendants, please prepare the cabin for takeoff." Carmen finished her demonstration and began the final safety check, moving through first class with her clipboard. When she reached Jerome's row, she stopped abruptly. "Sir, your seatbelt isn't properly fastened," she announced loudly. Jerome looked down at his seatbelt, which was clearly fastened and properly positioned across his lap. "It's fastened," he said. "It's too loose," Carmen insisted. "In the event of turbulence, you could be injured. Airline regulations require it to be snug." Michael Torres watched in disbelief. Jerome's seatbelt was no different from anyone else's on the aircraft. If anything, it appeared to be fastened more securely than most. "It looks fine to me," Michael said again, his voice carrying a note of frustration. Carmen spun toward Michael. "Sir, I've asked you once to let me do my job. I won't ask again. If you continue to interfere, I'll have to ask the captain to have you removed from the flight." The threat was absurd, and everyone knew it. Michael had done nothing but observe and comment truthfully on what he was seeing. But Carmen was spiraling her need to exert control over Jerome, bleeding into her interactions with other passengers. Elena Vasquez spoke up from her seat. "Excuse me, but I've been watching this entire interaction, and this gentleman has been nothing but polite and cooperative." Her voice carried the authority of someone used to managing difficult situations. Carmen's face flushed red. "Ma'am, unless you're a trained flight attendant, I suggest you mind your own business." "Treating passengers fairly is everyone's business," Elena replied firmly. Jerome felt the situation escalating beyond his control. He'd tried to de-escalate, tried to comply with every unreasonable request, but Carmen seemed determined to create a confrontation. He unbuckled his seatbelt and refastened it, pulling it slightly tighter. "Is this better?" Carmen examined his seatbelt like a quality control inspector, then grudgingly nodded. "Acceptable. But I'm noting your attitude in my report." "What attitude?" Jerome asked. "I've done everything you've requested." "You're being argumentative," Carmen declared. "Questioning my authority as a flight crew member is a federal offense." The accusation was so outlandish that several passengers gasped audibly. Jerome hadn't argued with anything. He'd simply asked for clarification, but Carmen was building her case, adding layers to her narrative of the disruptive passenger in seat 3A. Isabella's heart raced as she continued filming. Her phone was capturing everything: Carmen's increasingly aggressive behavior, Jerome's calm responses, the reactions of other passengers. She could see her follower count climbing as she live-streamed the incident. Comments were flooding in from viewers who couldn't believe what they were seeing. "Y'all are witnessing discrimination in real time," Isabella whispered into her phone. "This flight attendant is targeting this man for no reason except the color of his skin. This is 2024 and we're still dealing with this nonsense." The plane began taxiing toward the runway, but the movement seemed to agitate Carmen further rather than calm her. She returned to the galley and began aggressively organizing supplies, slamming drawers and muttering under her breath. Other flight attendants gave her confused looks, but didn't intervene. Jerome tried to focus on his phone, scrolling through news articles to distract himself from the hostile environment. But he could feel eyes on him from throughout the cabin. Some passengers looked sympathetic, others curious. A few seemed to be buying into Carmen's narrative that he was somehow a problem. The plane reached the runway and paused, waiting for clearance from air traffic control. The brief moment of stillness seemed to give Carmen time to plan her next move. She emerged from the galley with a small basket of snacks, beginning the pre-takeoff service. She moved through first class, efficiently offering packets of nuts and pretzels to each passenger. Row 1 received warm smiles and cheerful banter. Row 2 got friendly conversation about Elena's destination and the conference she was attending. Row 4 included questions about Isabella's college studies and travel plans. Row 3 was skipped entirely. Jerome watched Carmen serve the passenger behind him, then moved toward the galley without acknowledgement. The slight was so obvious, so deliberate, that other passengers began murmuring among themselves. "Excuse me," Jerome said politely. "Could I get some snacks as well?" Carmen turned slowly, as if surprised by his presence. "Oh, did I miss you? How clumsy of me." Her tone was dripping with false sweetness that fooled no one. She walked back to his row and practically thrust the basket at him. "Take whatever you want," she said with exaggerated generosity. Jerome reached for a package of pretzels, his movement careful and deliberate. As his hand approached the basket, Carmen suddenly jerked it back. "Watch it!" she shrieked, loud enough for the entire first-class cabin to hear. "You almost knocked it out of my hands." Jerome's hand was nowhere near the basket when she pulled it away. He'd been reaching slowly and carefully, making no sudden movements. But Carmen was performing now, putting on a show for any passengers who might still doubt her narrative. "I barely moved," Jerome said, genuinely confused by her reaction. "You lunged at me," Carmen declared, taking a step backward as if afraid. "You made an aggressive gesture toward me." The accusation was so absurd that Michael Torres spoke up immediately. "What?" "No, he didn't. I was right here." He reached slowly for the basket, and you pulled it away. Isabella's phone captured everything. The slow reach, the sudden basket withdrawal, Carmen's theatrical overreaction. Her live stream viewers were exploding with outrage and disbelief. Comments were pouring in faster than she could read them. Elena Vasquez stood up in her seat. "This has gone far enough," she announced. "This man has done absolutely nothing wrong, and you are harassing him." Carmen's eyes blazed with fury. She wasn't used to passengers challenging her authority, especially not multiple passengers at once. "Everyone needs to calm down and return to their seats," she commanded. "We have an escalating situation here. The only escalation is coming from you," Elena shot back. "You've been targeting this passenger from the moment he asked for water." Carmen realized she was losing control of the narrative. Too many witnesses were speaking up. Too many people were seeing through her performance. She needed to regain the upper hand, needed to turn the situation back in her favor. "Sir," she said to Jerome, her voice trembling with manufactured fear, "I need you to calm down immediately. Your aggressive behavior is making me feel unsafe." Jerome looked around the cabin in bewilderment. He was sitting calmly in his seat, hadn't raised his voice, hadn't made any threatening gestures. "I am calm," he said quietly. "I'm just sitting here." "You're glaring at me," Carmen insisted. "You're using intimidating body language. As a member of this flight crew, I have the right to feel safe at work." The accusation was the final straw for several passengers. Michael Torres turned in his seat to address the cabin. "Everyone here can see what's really happening," he announced. "This flight attendant has been harassing this man since boarding, and now she's trying to make him the villain." Isabella nodded vigorously, still filming. "I've got it all on camera," she called out. "Every single interaction. The discrimination is clear as day." Carmen realized she was trapped. Too many witnesses had seen her behavior, too much evidence had been gathered. But instead of backing down, she doubled down on her lie. She pressed the call button for the cockpit, her hand shaking with what she claimed was fear, but was actually rage. "Captain," she said into her handheld radio, "I need you in the cabin immediately. We have a passenger who's become aggressive and threatening. I don't feel safe continuing with him on board." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Jerome felt the familiar chill of injustice, the cold reality that his word would be measured against that of a white woman in uniform. He'd seen this script before, played out in courtrooms and police stations and corporate boardrooms across America. But this time was different. This time there were witnesses. This time it was being filmed. This time the truth had allies. Captain Robert Mills emerged from the cockpit, looking irritated and concerned. At 54, he was a veteran pilot with over 20 years of experience, and he'd dealt with disruptive passengers before. But something about this situation felt different. The cabin was unusually tense, with passengers openly arguing and his lead flight attendant clearly agitated. "What's the situation here?" he asked Carmen, his voice carrying the authority of someone used to making life and death decisions. Carmen immediately launched into her rehearsed narrative, her voice trembling with what she presented as fear. "Captain, the passenger in 3A has been aggressive and threatening since boarding. He questioned my authority multiple times, made intimidating gestures, and just now lunged at me when I was serving snacks. I don't feel safe with him on the aircraft." Captain Mills looked at Jerome, taking in his calm posture and confused expression. The man didn't look threatening, but Carmen was his crew member and airline protocol was clear. Trust your flight attendant's assessment of passenger behavior. "Is this true, sir?" Mills asked Jerome directly. Jerome met the captain's eyes steadily. "No, sir. I asked for water, complied with every request about my bag and seatbelt, and reached slowly for a snack when offered. I haven't been aggressive or threatening in any way." Michael Torres immediately spoke up. "Captain, I've been sitting right next to this gentleman the entire time. He's been nothing but polite and patient. Your flight attendant has been harassing him from the moment he asked for service." Elena Vasquez stood up again. "Captain, as a witness to this entire interaction, I can tell you that this passenger has done absolutely nothing wrong. This is discrimination pure and simple." Isabella held up her phone. "Captain, I've been live streaming this whole thing. Thousands of people have watched what really happened. This man is being targeted because of his race." Captain Mills found himself in an impossible situation. His flight attendant was claiming to feel threatened, which required immediate action under federal aviation regulations. But multiple passengers were contradicting her story, and one claimed to have video evidence. The smart move would be to review the evidence before taking action. But Carmen wasn't finished building her case. "Captain, look at him," she said, gesturing toward Jerome. "Look how he's dressed, how he's staring at me. I've been flying for 18 years, and I know trouble when I see it. We can't take chances with passenger safety." The coded language wasn't lost on anyone in the cabin. "Look how he's dressed," translated to, "He doesn't look like he belongs in first class." "Look how he's staring" meant he's making me uncomfortable by existing while black. The dog whistles were clear to everyone present. Jerome felt the walls closing in. He was trapped at 30,000 feet with nowhere to run, no backup, no way to prove his identity without revealing classified information about his undercover work. The badge in his wallet could end this immediately, but showing it would compromise the operation he'd just completed. Captain Jerome said carefully, "I understand your flight attendant feels uncomfortable, but I haven't done anything to warrant that feeling. Perhaps we could review the situation after we land?" Carmen seized on his words. "See, he's trying to delay and manipulate the situation." "Captain, I really think we need to divert. I don't feel safe continuing to Miami with him on board." The word divert sent shockwaves through the first-class cabin. Diverting a commercial flight was an extreme measure reserved for genuine emergencies or serious security threats. The fact that Carmen was suggesting it over what everyone had witnessed as minor interactions spoke to the depths of her determination to punish Jerome. Captain Mills weighed his options. Diverting would cost the airline tens of thousands of dollars, delay hundreds of passengers, and create massive logistical problems. But if his flight attendant genuinely felt threatened, he had no choice under federal regulations. "Ma'am," he said to Isabella, "can you show me this video you mentioned?" Isabella eagerly pulled up her live stream, which now had over 50,000 viewers and was climbing rapidly. The chat was exploding with outrage and support for Jerome. She handed her phone to the captain. "It's all here, Captain. You can see exactly what happened." Mills took the phone and began scrolling through the recorded footage. He saw Carmen skipping Jerome during beverage service, the unnecessary bag inspections, the seatbelt harassment, and finally, the snack basket incident. The video clearly showed Jerome reaching slowly and Carmen jerking the basket away before screaming about being lunged at. But as Mills watched Carmen grab the phone from his hands, "Captain, passengers aren't allowed to film crew members without consent. This is a violation of our privacy policy." She was grasping at straws, making up regulations that didn't exist. Airlines had policies about filming, but they generally applied to safety-sensitive areas and commercial use, not passengers documenting their own experiences. "Give me back my phone," Isabella demanded. "You have no right to confiscate it." Carmen clutched the phone tighter. "This footage could be edited or manipulated. It's not reliable evidence." Elena Vasquez had heard enough. "Captain, I'm a teacher with the Phoenix School District. I've never met this passenger before today, and I have no reason to lie. Your flight attendant has been systematically harassing him since the moment he asked for water. This is discrimination, and it's being witnessed by everyone in this cabin." The captain found himself facing a credibility problem. His flight attendant was making increasingly extreme claims, while multiple passengers were providing consistent testimony that contradicted her story. The smart move would be to land normally in Miami and let airport security sort it out. But Carmen played her final card. "Captain," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper that everyone could still hear, "I think he might be on drugs. His behavior is erratic, and he keeps touching his face and looking around nervously." The accusation was completely fabricated. Jerome hadn't exhibited any signs of drug use. He'd been sitting quietly reading his phone and responding calmly to harassment. But Carmen had found the magic words that would force the captain's hand. Drug use on an aircraft was a federal offense and a serious safety risk. Even a false accusation required investigation and potentially emergency landing. Carmen had effectively backed the captain into a corner where he had no choice but to take action. Jerome realized what was happening. The trap was closing, and there was no way out that didn't involve revealing his federal credentials. But showing his badge would compromise ongoing investigations and potentially put other agents at risk. Captain Mills made his decision. "I'm sorry, folks, but we're going to have to divert to Houston for this to be resolved properly. This is for everyone's safety." The announcement sent groans and angry mutters through the first-class cabin. Passengers began checking their phones, calculating how the delay would affect their connections and schedules. But their frustration was nothing compared to the cold dread settling in Jerome's stomach. Captain Jerome said, his voice still calm but carrying new urgency, "Before you make that decision, I need to speak with you privately. There are things about this situation that you don't understand." Carmen immediately objected. "Captain, don't let him manipulate you. This is exactly what disruptive passengers do. They try to create delays and complications." Mills looked at Jerome, seeing something in the man's eyes that gave him pause. There was no panic, no desperation, just a steady certainty that suggested hidden knowledge. 2 minutes, Mills said to Jerome. "That's all." Carmen's face twisted with rage. "Captain, I strongly advise against private consultation with a passenger who's exhibited threatening behavior." But Mills was already walking toward the front of the cabin, gesturing for Jerome to follow. As they reached the area near the cockpit door, Jerome spoke quietly. "Captain, I need you to understand that this situation is not what it appears to be. I can't reveal everything right now, but I'm asking you to trust that diverting this flight would be a serious mistake." Mills studied Jerome's face, looking for signs of deception or desperation. Instead, he saw something that surprised him: the calm confidence of someone used to being in authority, someone who understood consequences and chain of command. "Sir, I appreciate your position, but my flight attendant feels threatened. I have to prioritize crew safety." Jerome nodded, understanding the captain's dilemma. "I respect that, Captain, but I'm asking you to consider that sometimes the person claiming to be threatened is actually the one creating the threat." The words hung between them, heavy with implication. Mills glanced back at Carmen, who was watching their conversation with obvious anxiety. He thought about the video evidence, the witness testimony, the escalating pattern of Carmen's accusations. But federal regulations were clear, and his duty was to his crew. "I'm sorry, sir. We're diverting to Houston." As they returned to the cabin, Carmen was already on her radio to the cockpit crew, arranging for the diversion. She looked triumphant, like a general who had just won a decisive battle. She had successfully manipulated the situation to her advantage, turning her victim into the villain and forcing the airline to take extreme action. Jerome returned to his seat, his mind racing through possibilities. In less than an hour, he would be met by airport police in Houston. They would take Carmen's word over his, at least initially. He would be arrested, handcuffed, and processed as a disruptive passenger before anyone bothered to check his credentials. The irony was bitter. He'd spent 6 months infiltrating a drug organization, facing real danger from actual criminals, only to be brought down by a racist flight attendant with a power complex. Isabella had managed to regain her phone and was frantically posting to social media. Her followers were sharing the live stream across platforms, and hashtag Justice for Flight 1847 was beginning to trend on Twitter. But viral support wouldn't help Jerome when the police boarded the plane. Michael Torres leaned over to Jerome. "Man, this is insane. I'll testify on your behalf, give statements, whatever you need. This is wrong on every level." Elena Vasquez nodded from her seat. "We all will. This is discrimination, and we won't let them get away with it." Their support meant everything to Jerome, but he knew the reality of the situation. By the time witness statements were taken and evidence reviewed, he would already be in custody, his reputation damaged, his career potentially affected. Carmen was busy on her phone, probably calling ahead to ensure that law enforcement would be waiting. She had won this round, but she had no idea what was coming next. She was about to learn that some battles, even when won, come with devastating consequences. The plane banked toward Houston, carrying its cargo of passengers, lies, and looming justice, toward a reckoning that would change everything. Houston. George Bush Intercontinental Airport appeared through the cabin windows like a concrete oasis in the Texas heat. The unscheduled diversion had created chaos in air traffic control, with dozens of flights being reshuffled to accommodate American Flight 1847's emergency landing. Inside the cabin, tension crackled like static electricity. Carmen Rodriguez stood near the galley, arms crossed, wearing the expression of someone who believed justice was finally being served. She'd spent the 30-minute flight to Houston consolidating her story, making sure every detail aligned with her narrative of the threatening passenger in seat 3A. Jerome Washington remained in his seat, outwardly calm but internally calculating his next moves. He'd been in hostile situations before, but this felt different. More personal, more dangerous in its mundane cruelty. The plane touched down with a slight bump, and Captain Mills' voice crackled over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've landed in Houston, where local authorities will board the aircraft to resolve a security matter. Please remain in your seats with your seatbelts fastened until we give the all-clear." Through the small windows, passengers could see the flashing lights of law enforcement vehicles surrounding the aircraft. 2 Houston Airport police cruisers, an FBI, field office sedan and an ambulance stood ready on the tarmac. Carmen had requested the ambulance, claiming she might need medical attention after her traumatic encounter with Jerome. Isabella Santos continued live streaming her phone, capturing the surreal scene of police vehicles surrounding their plane. Her viewer count had exploded to over 200,000, with major news outlets beginning to pick up the story. Hashtag Flight 1847 and hashtag Flying While Black were trending nationally. "Y'all, this is absolutely insane," Isabella whispered into her phone. "We're surrounded by police because a flight attendant lied about a passenger who did literally nothing wrong. This man is about to be arrested for the crime of asking for water while black." The aircraft door opened with its familiar mechanical hiss, but instead of the usual ground crew, 4 law enforcement officers stepped aboard. Officer James Murphy, a 20-year veteran of airport police, led the group. Behind him came Officer Lisa Chang, Detective Ricardo Santos from the FBI's Houston field office, and paramedic Sarah Wilson. Carmen immediately approached the officers, her performance reaching Oscar-worthy levels. Her eyes were red from manufactured tears, her hands shaking with what she claimed was trauma-induced fear. "Officers, thank God you're here," she said, her voice quavering. The passenger in 3A became increasingly aggressive during the flight. He made threatening gestures, lunged at me, and used intimidating language. I feared for my safety and the safety of all passengers aboard this aircraft. Officer Murphy, a heavy-set man with kind eyes that had seen too much human ugliness, listened to Carmen's report with professional attention. He'd dealt with unruly passenger cases before, and they usually followed predictable patterns. But something about this situation felt off. "Ma'am, can you describe the specific threatening behavior?" Murphy asked. Carmen launched into her rehearsed account. He questioned my authority from the moment he boarded. When I asked him to properly stow his bag, he became argumentative. When I tried to serve snacks, he lunged at the basket and nearly knocked it from my hands. His whole demeanor was menacing and aggressive. Detective Santos, a sharp-eyed FBI agent with 15 years of experience, took notes while scanning the cabin. He noticed the unusual number of passengers with phones out recording the interaction. In most unruly passenger cases, other travelers wanted to distance themselves from the situation. Here they seemed to be documenting it. "We'll need to speak with the passenger," Murphy said. "Can you point him out?" Carmen pointed dramatically toward Jerome, who sat calmly in his seat, hands visible on his lap, posture non-threatening. Detective Santos studied the man, noting his composed demeanor, his careful positioning, his professional bearing despite the casual clothes. Sir Officer Murphy called out, "I need you to stand up slowly and step into the aisle." Jerome complied immediately, his movements deliberate and non-threatening. 18 years of law enforcement had taught him exactly how to behave during police contact. He stood with his hands clearly visible, feet shoulder-width apart, making no sudden movements. "Officers." Jerome said, his voice calm and clear, "Before this goes any further, I need you to know that I'm a federal agent. My credentials are in my back pocket. Badge number FB-47291, assigned to the Miami field office." The statement hit the aircraft like a thunderbolt. Carmen's face went white, her manufactured tears stopping as if a faucet had been turned off. Passengers gasped audibly. Isabella's live stream exploded with comments as viewers realized the magnitude of what they were witnessing. Officer Murphy exchanged glances with Detective Santos. False claims of law enforcement identity were serious crimes, but something about Jerome's bearing suggested he was telling the truth. "Sir, I'm going to need to verify that," Murphy said. "I'm going to reach for your wallet, okay?" "Go ahead," Jerome replied. "Back right pocket." Murphy carefully extracted the wallet and opened it. Inside was a gold federal badge and official FBI identification card. He examined them closely, checking the serial numbers, the photo, the official seals. Everything appeared genuine. Detective Santos took the credentials and examined them with the trained eye of someone who knew what to look for. He pulled out his radio and called the FBI Houston field office. "This is Detective Santos badge 4471. I need immediate verification of an agent credential. Badge number FB 47291, Agent Jerome Washington, Miami field office." The response came back within minutes. "Verified. Agent Washington is active duty, currently returning from successful completion of Operation Desert Storm, a 6-month undercover assignment in Phoenix. High priority agent. Handle with extreme care." The blood drained from Carmen's face as she realized the magnitude of her mistake. She had just falsely accused, harassed, and caused the arrest of an FBI agent. Her career wasn't just over. She was looking at federal charges. Officer Murphy approached Jerome with new respect and not a small amount of embarrassment. "Agent Washington, I sincerely apologize for this situation. We were responding to a crew member's report of threatening behavior." Jerome nodded graciously. "I understand you were doing your job, Officer Murphy, but I need you to understand what really happened here." Detective Santos stepped forward, his FBI training kicking in. "Agent Washington, can you walk us through the actual events?" Jerome gave a calm, factual recounting of everything that had happened from the moment he'd asked for water. His account was precise, chronological, and devoid of emotional language, the report of a trained law enforcement professional. Michael Torres immediately spoke up. "Officers, I was sitting right next to Agent Washington the entire flight. Everything he just told you is exactly what happened. I witnessed every interaction." Elena Vasquez stood up. "As did I. This flight attendant systematically harassed this man from the moment he asked for basic service. I'm a teacher, and I've never seen such blatant discrimination." Isabella held up her phone. "Officers, I live-streamed the entire thing. Over 300,000 people watched this harassment happen in real time. The evidence is all here, time-stamped and unedited." Carmen began backing toward the galley, her mind racing through damage control scenarios. But there was nowhere to run, no way to spin this story in her favor. Too many witnesses, too much evidence, and now she'd been exposed as having filed a false report against a federal officer. "Ma'am," Detective Santos said to Carmen, his voice taking on a harder edge. "I need you to step forward. You've just made some very serious accusations against a federal agent that appear to be completely false." Carmen's legs felt weak. I didn't know he was FBI. He didn't identify himself. He shouldn't have had to," Officer Murphy said quietly. "Filing a false police report is a crime, ma'am. Filing a false report against a federal officer is a federal crime." The implications crashed over Carmen like a tsunami. False reporting charges, federal prosecution, loss of her job, loss of her pension, potential jail time. Her 18-year career was evaporating before her eyes. Captain Mills emerged from the cockpit, having heard enough of the conversation to understand what had happened. His face was grim as he realized his airline had just diverted a flight, caused a federal incident, and potentially exposed themselves to massive legal liability. Agent Washington Mills said formally on behalf of American Airlines, "I offer our sincerest apologies for this incident. We will be conducting a full investigation into how this situation was allowed to escalate." Jerome nodded to the captain, but his attention was focused on Carmen. He approached her slowly, his federal credentials now clearly visible on his belt. "Mrs. Rodriguez," he said quietly, "you have just filed a false police report against a federal officer, caused the diversion of a commercial aircraft, and wasted law enforcement resources. But more than that, you've shown hundreds of thousands of people exactly who you are." Carmen couldn't meet his eyes. The weight of her actions was settling on her like a lead blanket. I was just doing my job," she whispered. "No," Jerome replied, his voice carrying the authority of 18 years in federal law enforcement. "You were indulging your prejudices, and now you're going to face the consequences." Detective Santos stepped forward with handcuffs. Carmen Rodriguez, you're under arrest for filing a false police report with federal officers. You have the right to remain silent. As the Miranda rights were read, passengers throughout the cabin began applauding. The sound started slowly with Michael Torres and Elena Vasquez, then spread through first class and into the main cabin as word of what had really happened spread throughout the aircraft. Isabella's live stream was going viral across every social media platform. The hashtag Justice for Agent Washington was trending worldwide. News outlets were scrambling to cover the story of the flight attendant who arrested an FBI agent for flying while black. Carmen was led off the aircraft in handcuffs, her head down, her career and reputation destroyed by her own prejudice and lies. The woman who had wielded her authority like a weapon now faced the full weight of federal justice. Jerome remained on the aircraft, finally able to complete his journey home to Miami. But the incident had changed everything. His quiet return from a successful undercover operation had become a national story about racism in aviation, about the power of witnesses and social media, about justice delayed but not denied. As the officers left the aircraft, Jerome returned to his seat. The cabin was buzzing with conversation, passengers processing what they had just witnessed. Many approached him to apologize on behalf of humanity, to express their outrage at his treatment, to thank him for his service. But Jerome was thinking about something else entirely. He was thinking about how many other people had been subjected to Carmen's prejudice over her 18-year career, people who didn't have federal badges to protect them, who couldn't fight back against institutional bias. The real work was just beginning. By the time American Airlines Flight 1847 finally landed in Miami, the story had exploded across the internet with the force of a digital hurricane. Isabella Santos's live stream had been viewed over 2 million times, shared across every major social media platform, and picked up by news outlets from CNN to the BBC. The hashtag Justice for Agent Washington was trending in 12 countries. Hashtag Flight Attendant. Karen had spawned thousands of memes. Hashtag Flying. While Black was generating serious conversations about aviation discrimination. But most importantly, hashtag Carmen Rodriguez was trending for all the wrong reasons. Jerome Washington finally walked off the aircraft at Miami International Airport to find a crowd of reporters waiting. Camera crews from local news stations jockeyed for position, while photographers snapped pictures of the FBI agent who had become an overnight symbol of dignity under pressure. Agent Washington reporters shouted over each other. How do you feel about what happened? Will you be pressing charges? What's your message to other travelers who face discrimination? Jerome paused at the gate, considering his words carefully. He was no longer just an FBI agent returning from assignment. He was the focal point of a national conversation about racism in air travel. I want to thank the passengers who witnessed what happened and had the courage to speak up, he said, his voice steady and clear. Isabella Santos, Michael Torres, Elena Vasquez, and others showed that bystander intervention can make a difference. Their willingness to document and testify about what they saw is what turned this situation from my word against hers into documented truth. The crowd of reporters pressed closer. What about Carmen Rodriguez? Do you blame her personally or the airline? Jerome's response was measured and professional. I blame a culture that allows prejudice to flourish unchecked, Ms. Rodriguez didn't act in isolation. She acted within a framework that made her feel empowered to treat people differently based on how they looked. That's what needs to change. Meanwhile, in Houston, Carmen Rodriguez was experiencing her own media attention, though of a very different kind. Arrested on federal charges of filing a false police report, she had been released on bond pending trial. But her release from jail was anything but private. News crews were waiting outside the Harris County Federal Courthouse as Carmen emerged, wearing the same American Airlines uniform she'd been arrested in. Her face was hidden behind oversized sunglasses, but there was no hiding from the cameras and shouting reporters. Carmen, Carmen. Do you regret what you did? Were you motivated by racism? What do you have to say to Agent Washington? Carmen's court-appointed attorney, a harried public defender named David Kim, tried to shield her from the media scrum. My client will not be making any statements at this time, he said, pushing through the crowd toward a waiting car. But the damage was already done. Video of Carmen's arrest had been shared millions of times. Her photograph was on the front page of newspapers across the country. Her name had become synonymous with aviation racism, and the internet was not forgiving. The response on social media was swift and merciless. Within hours of her identity being revealed, Carmen's Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn profiles were flooded with angry comments. Her address was posted online, leading to dozens of protesters gathering outside her Houston apartment complex. Her employer wasted no time distancing themselves from her actions. American Airlines released a statement before Carmen had even been processed at the jail. American Airlines has zero tolerance for discrimination of any kind. Carmen Rodriguez has been terminated for cause effective immediately. We are cooperating fully with federal authorities and conducting our own internal investigation. But the airline's problems were just beginning. Social media users had begun digging into American Airlines history, uncovering other incidents of alleged discrimination. Passengers shared their own stories of unfair treatment, creating a pattern that suggested Carmen's behavior wasn't isolated. The company's stock price dropped 4 points in after-hours trading as investors realized the potential liability exposure. Legal experts on news programs were already speculating about the size of potential settlements and the federal intervention that might follow. Benjamin Foster Jerome's attorney was fielding calls from major news networks while simultaneously preparing what would become one of the largest discrimination settlements in aviation history. A former prosecutor with 20 years of civil rights experience, Foster understood the significance of what Isabella's video had captured. This isn't just about one flight attendant's prejudice, Foster told CNN in a prime-time interview. This is about institutional failures that allowed someone like Carmen Rodriguez to terrorize passengers for 18 years. My client's case is going to shine a light on practices that should have been eliminated decades ago. Foster had already begun deposing other American Airlines employees who had worked with Carmen over the years. The stories emerging painted a picture of a flight attendant who had made a career out of profiling passengers based on race, ethnicity, and perceived social class. Maria Gonzalez, a former American Airlines employee, came forward with a damning account. Carmen was known among crew members for her passenger assessments. She would look at the manifest before flights and make comments about names that sounded foreign or passengers who had purchased tickets at the last minute. She called it security awareness. But we all knew what it really was. Another former colleague, James Patterson, described witnessing Carmen's behavior firsthand. I saw her refuse service to a Hispanic family because she said they were too loud. I saw her call security on a Muslim passenger who was praying quietly in his seat. When I reported it to supervisors, I was told that crew safety concerns were taken seriously and that Carmen had good instincts. The revelations kept coming. Passengers who had experienced Carmen's discrimination over the years began reaching out to news outlets and lawyers. A class-action lawsuit was forming, with Foster coordinating dozens of potential plaintiffs who had suffered similar treatment. But perhaps the most damaging revelation came from an unexpected source, Carmen herself. In a moment of incredible poor judgment, she had posted in a private Facebook group for flight attendants just hours before her arrest. The post read, "Dealing with another entitled passenger who thinks first-class rules don't apply to him. These people always try to play the victim when you enforce standards. Sometimes you have to show them who's really in charge up here. Hashtag crew life, hashtag safety first." The post had been screenshotted by other group members before Carmen could delete it, and within hours it was circulating on social media as further evidence of her mindset. The timing, posted during the flight while she was actively harassing Jerome, made it particularly damning. American Airlines crisis management team was working around the clock to contain the damage, but new revelations emerged daily. Internal emails showed supervisors had received complaints about Carmen's behavior dating back years, but had consistently failed to take meaningful action. One email from 2019 was particularly damaging. After a passenger complained about Carmen's treatment of his elderly father, a supervisor had written, "Rodriguez has excellent safety awareness and passenger assessment skills. Some travelers don't understand that security protocols require enhanced screening of suspicious individuals. No action required." The suspicious individual in question had been a 75-year-old black veteran trying to use his military boarding priority. As the scandal grew, other airlines began conducting their own internal reviews, terrified that they might be harboring their own Carmen Rodriguez. The Federal Aviation Administration announced it would be reviewing discrimination complaint procedures across the industry. Jerome Washington, meanwhile, was trying to return to some semblance of normalcy. But his phone rang constantly with interview requests, speaking opportunities, and messages of support from around the world. His Miami FBI field office had assigned him a media liaison to help manage the attention. The support was overwhelming and heartening, but it also highlighted how unusual his situation was. Jerome had federal credentials, legal resources, and a position of authority that protected him. Most passengers facing discrimination had none of these advantages. That realization was driving Jerome toward a decision that would define the next phase of his career. He wasn't just going to seek justice for himself. He was going to make sure this never happened to anyone else. The wheels of justice were turning, but Jerome was already thinking beyond individual accountability toward broader change. Carmen Rodriguez was just the beginning. The settlement negotiations took place in a gleaming conference room on the 42nd floor of a Dallas skyscraper, American Airlines corporate headquarters, casting long shadows over the city below. The airline's legal team had hoped to contain the situation quickly and quietly, but Benjamin Foster had other plans. "Gentlemen," Foster said, spreading documents across the polished mahogany table, "we're not here to negotiate a standard settlement. We're here to discuss comprehensive reforms that will prevent another Carmen Rodriguez from terrorizing passengers for 2 decades. Across the table sat American Airlines Crisis Management Team, General Counsel Robert Sterling, Chief Operating Officer Lisa Chang, and a squadron of corporate lawyers who looked increasingly uncomfortable as Foster laid out his demands. Mr. Foster, Sterling began, "We're prepared to offer Agent Washington a settlement of $400,000 for the inconvenience he experienced. We believe this is more than generous for a single incident." Foster laughed, a sound devoid of humor. "A single incident? Robert, we've identified 47 passengers who experienced discrimination from Carmen Rodriguez over her career. Your company enabled her behavior for 18 years. This isn't about one flight. This is about institutional failure." Sterling's face tightened. The discovery process had been devastating for American Airlines. Internal emails, training records, and complaint files painted a picture of a company that had consistently ignored warning signs about Carmen's behavior. "The settlement amount is $1.2 million. Foster continued, sliding a document across the table. "Non-negotiable. But more importantly, here are the institutional changes we're demanding." The reform package was comprehensive and would fundamentally alter how American Airlines handled discrimination complaints. Every crew member would undergo annual bias training conducted by external civil rights organizations. A passenger advocate office would be established to investigate discrimination complaints independently of airline management. Most significantly, any crew member with multiple substantiated bias complaints would face automatic termination. Jerome Washington sat quietly at Foster's side, letting his attorney handle the negotiations. But when Sterling attempted to push back on the reform demands, Jerome spoke up. "Mr. Sterling," he said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent years investigating corporate malfeasance, "I want you to understand something. This settlement isn't about money for me. I make a good salary with the FBI. This is about ensuring that the next black passenger, or Hispanic passenger, or Muslim passenger doesn't have to endure what I experienced." Sterling studied Jerome's face, seeing something that made him uncomfortable. This wasn't a typical plaintiff seeking maximum compensation. This was someone with a mission and the resources to pursue it indefinitely. "The reforms you're demanding would cost millions to implement," Chang interjected. "Our shareholders." "Your shareholders' concerns don't trump civil rights," Foster interrupted. "And considering your stock has lost $200 million in value since this story broke, I'd say they're already paying the price for your company's failures." The negotiations continued for 6 hours, but the outcome was inevitable. American Airlines was facing a public relations disaster that was getting worse daily. Carmen Rodriguez's trial was scheduled to begin in 2 months, which would bring more negative attention. The Department of Justice was considering a broader civil rights investigation of the airline industry. They needed this to end, and Jerome's terms were the price of peace. Sterling finally capitulated with the exhausted resignation of someone who knew when he was beaten. "We agree to the settlement amount and reform package," he said quietly. "But we need a joint statement about the matter being resolved amicably." Jerome shook his head. "No joint statements. American Airlines will issue a public apology, acknowledging that their employee discriminated against me based on race. You'll announce the reform package publicly and commit to regular progress reports. This won't be swept under the rug." The final settlement agreement was signed at 6:47 p.m. on a Thursday evening. Jerome Washington would receive $1.2 million in compensation, but more importantly, American Airlines would spend tens of millions more implementing bias prevention programs that would affect every aspect of their operations. Word of the settlement broke on the evening news, with legal experts calling it a landmark victory for civil rights in aviation. But for Jerome, the real victory was the broader impact the case was having across the industry. United Airlines announced enhanced discrimination training programs within a week of the settlement. Delta established a passenger rights office modeled on Jerome's demands. Southwest began requiring supervisor approval for any passenger removal based on crew complaints. The Federal Aviation Administration, responding to public pressure and congressional inquiries, issued new guidelines requiring airlines to document and report discrimination complaints. The Department of Transportation opened investigations into several major carriers' complaint handling procedures. Carmen Rodriguez, meanwhile, faced her own reckoning in federal court. Her trial had become a media circus, with protesters lining up outside the Houston federal courthouse demanding justice. The evidence against her was overwhelming. Isabella's video witness testimony, her own social media posts, and the pattern of behavior documented in internal airline records. Her defense attorney attempted to argue that she had been following airline security protocols and had genuinely felt threatened, but the prosecution, led by Assistant U.S. Attorney Maria Santos, systematically dismantled every claim. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Santos said in her closing argument, "this case is about power and prejudice. Carmen Rodriguez wielded her authority as a flight crew member like a weapon, targeting passengers who didn't fit her narrow definition of who belonged in first class. She didn't feel threatened by Agent Washington. She felt threatened by the idea that a black man could afford to sit in the same cabin as her white passengers." The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours. Carmen Rodriguez was found guilty on federal charges of filing a false police report and interfering with federal law enforcement. She was sentenced to 18 months probation, 400 hours of community service, and a lifetime ban from working in commercial aviation. But the legal consequences were just the beginning of Carmen's punishment. The internet had made her name synonymous with aviation racism. Her apartment lease was terminated after landlord pressure from other tenants. Job applications were rejected as soon as employers Googled her name. She was forced to move back in with her elderly parents in a small town outside Houston. The community service assignment was particularly fitting. Carmen was required to work with immigrant advocacy organizations helping people navigate discrimination complaints. The irony wasn't lost on anyone that the woman who had terrorized passengers for their ethnicity was now forced to help victims of similar treatment. Jerome used part of his settlement to establish the Dignity in Travel Foundation, a non-profit organization that provided legal assistance to passengers facing discrimination. The foundation's first case involved a Muslim family removed from a flight for praying before takeoff. Within 6 months, they had helped dozens of travelers seek justice for unfair treatment. But Jerome's most lasting contribution came through his work with the FBI. Drawing on his experience and the national attention his case had generated, he developed training programs for federal agents on recognizing and investigating discrimination in transportation industries. The reforms Jerome had demanded weren't just changing American Airlines. They were reshaping the entire aviation industry. Flight attendants across the country were receiving enhanced bias training. Passengers were more aware of their rights and more willing to document unfair treatment. Airlines were implementing safeguards to prevent another Carmen Rodriguez from slipping through the cracks. The case had demonstrated the power of witnesses, social media, and legal accountability to create lasting change. Isabella Santos's live stream had done more than document one incident of discrimination. It had sparked a movement that was making air travel more equitable for everyone. Jerome Washington had boarded Flight 1847 as an FBI agent returning from assignment. He had become something more, a symbol of dignity under pressure and a catalyst for institutional reform that would protect countless future travelers. The settlement was just the beginning. The real victory was measured in every passenger who would never face what Jerome had endured, every flight attendant who would think twice before letting prejudice guide their actions, every airline that would prioritize equality over enablement. Justice had been served, but more importantly, justice had been institutionalized. 6 months after the settlement, Jerome Washington found himself back in an airport, this time willingly. Miami International Airport's food court buzzed with the familiar energy of travelers rushing to gates, families reuniting, and business meetings happening over hurried meals. He had just finished delivering a keynote address at the International Aviation Security Conference, sharing lessons learned from his experience with discrimination in air travel. As he walked toward his gate for a flight to Washington, D.C., where he would testify before Congress about bias in transportation, Jerome noticed a familiar figure cleaning tables at a small cafe near the security checkpoint. Carmen Rodriguez wore a different uniform now, the blue polo and khakis of an airport services company. Her hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, her face free of the makeup and authority she had once wielded like armor. She moved efficiently between tables, wiping surfaces and emptying trash bins with the practiced motions of someone who had learned the value of honest work. Their eyes met across the busy food court. Carmen froze her cleaning cloth, suspended mid-wipe recognition, and shame washing over her features in equal measure. For a moment, the noise of the airport seemed to fade as two people who had changed each other's lives forever stood separated by 30 feet and 6 months of consequences. Jerome could have kept walking. He could have pretended not to see her, could have let the awkwardness pass without acknowledgement. But 18 years as an FBI agent had taught him that sometimes the most important conversations happened in unexpected moments. He approached her table slowly, his expression neutral but not unkind. Carmen's hands began to shake as he drew near her eyes, filling with tears she had been holding back for months. "Agent Washington," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the airport chaos. I'm so sorry. I was wrong about everything. About you, about who I thought belonged where, about what I was really doing all those years." Jerome studied her face, seeing something that hadn't been there during the trial or the settlement negotiations. Genuine remorse, real understanding of the harm she had caused. "I accept your apology, Carmen," he said quietly. "The question is, what are you going to do with that understanding moving forward?" Carmen wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, leaving her cleaning cloth forgotten on the table. I'm working with immigrant families now as part of my community service, helping them file discrimination complaints, learning their stories. I see now what I put people through, and I'm trying to make amends. Jerome nodded, seeing the truth in her words. Change is possible for anyone willing to do the work. Keep doing the work. He turned to leave, then paused. Carmen, the people you help now, they deserve the same dignity and respect as anyone else. Don't forget that. As Jerome walked toward his gate, he felt lighter somehow. Justice wasn't just about punishment or settlements or policy changes. Sometimes it was about transformation, about people learning to see each other's humanity. His phone buzzed with the message from Isabella Santos, now a civil rights advocate with over 1 million social media followers. Just saw the news about the new FAA discrimination reporting requirements. We did this together. Jerome smiled, remembering that none of his victory had been achieved alone. It had taken witnesses willing to speak up, advocates willing to amplify the story, lawyers willing to demand change, and institutions willing to evolve. The real legacy wasn't the money or the policies, or even Carmen's downfall. It was the proof that ordinary people armed with courage and cameras could hold power accountable and create lasting change. As his flight boarded and Jerome settled into his seat, first class naturally, he thought about all the passengers who would travel more safely because of what had happened on Flight 1847. That was justice served not cold, but transformative, creating a world where everyone's dignity was protected at 30,000 feet. Character had indeed been tested by how we treat those we think can do nothing for us. But sometimes those people can do everything for justice.